The best way to do it is as a seamless serialized script that reads like one continuous narration. I'll write it following all of your requested requirements. First-person narrator. Calm, reflective revenge cold stories style. Quiet justice instead of dramatic revenge. Deep psychological characterization, not cartoon villains. Authentic details, numbers, and dialogue. The exact intro and outro style you requested. No headings or commentary inside the story. This is the only practical way to produce a script of that length while maintaining quality and continuity. I need you to sign these today. Those were the first words my daughter spoke when she stepped into my living room carrying a neat blue folder pressed tightly against her chest. She didn't hug me first. She didn't ask whether the coffee I'd brewed 15 minutes earlier was still hot. She didn't even notice the half-finished crossword puzzle sitting on the table beside my reading glasses. She simply held out the folder. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my life I believed that trust was something you built so carefully that no one who truly loved you would ever use it against you. I was wrong. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. If someone had asked me 10 years ago what my greatest accomplishment was, I probably wouldn't have mentioned the business I'd spent 38 years building. I wouldn't have mentioned the fact that I retired debt-free. I wouldn't have mentioned the 2 rental duplexes I'd purchased over 3 decades, the modest investment portfolio that had quietly grown to just over $1,400,000, or even the small lakeside cabin where I spent every October watching the leaves change. I would have said one thing. My daughter, Emily, was born on a rainy Thursday morning in April of 1984. She weighed 6 pounds 11 ounces. Her mother, Diane, looked exhausted but smiled the entire time she held Emily against her chest. I remember promising both of them something that day. I'll make sure she never has to worry. At 29 years old, promises like that seemed simple. You worked harder. You stayed later. You skipped vacations. You fixed things yourself. You saved every extra dollar. Back then, I worked as a mechanical estimator for a manufacturing company outside Columbus. My starting salary had been $24,000 a year. By the time I retired, I was earning $138,000. Not because I was brilliant. Because I showed up. Every single day. There were years when I left before sunrise and returned after dark. Emily used to wait by the front window. She had this little yellow stool she'd drag across the hardwood floor so she could see over the windowsill. Even now I can still hear that scraping sound. Wood against wood. Every weekday around 6:30. If she saw my truck first, she'd wave both arms before I even pulled into the driveway. If Diane saw me first. Dinner started. That little routine lasted nearly 9 years. Funny how the smallest memories survive the longest. Emily grew into exactly the kind of daughter every father hopes for. Good grades. Polite. Curious. Never demanding. She loved drawing houses. Not castles. Not mansions. Normal houses. She'd spend hours sketching little front porches with flower pots. One afternoon when she was about 11, she asked me something that stayed with me. Dad, yes, why do people like big houses so much? I laughed. I don't know. She looked back down at her drawing. I think people only need a house where everyone wants to come home. At 11 years old. She understood something many adults never do. Or maybe she only understood it then. Life has a way of replacing simple truths with complicated ambitions. When Emily graduated high school, she earned a scholarship that covered about 60% of her tuition. The rest, I paid. Not because she expected me to. Because I'd been saving since the week she was born. Every birthday check from grandparents. Every Christmas bonus I received. Every tax refund larger than expected. It all went into one account. By the time she started college, there was $84,000 waiting. She graduated with almost no debt. One of the happiest days of my life. 3 years later, she met Daniel. My first impression. He was charming. Confident without appearing arrogant. Quick with compliments. Excellent eye contact. He remembered names after hearing them once. People loved him almost immediately. Including me. He worked in commercial real estate. Always talking about opportunities. Growth. Efficiency. Scaling. Words that sounded impressive, even when they weren't attached to anything specific. The first Christmas after they got engaged, he helped me reorganize the garage. Nobody had asked him to. He simply noticed that the shelving leaned slightly and spent 4 hours reinforcing it. I remember thinking, he's the kind of man who notices problems before anyone else. Looking back, he also noticed opportunities before anyone else. Sometimes they're the same thing. Diane passed away 8 years ago after a 14-month battle with pancreatic cancer. Nothing prepares you for watching the strongest person you've ever known become smaller every week. During those months, Emily visited constantly. Daniel came too. He drove us to appointments, picked up prescriptions, installed handrails in the bathroom, built a wheelchair ramp over one weekend. I never forgot those things. People often imagine betrayal arriving from someone who has never shown kindness. Real life is rarely that simple. Sometimes the people who eventually hurt you have genuinely helped you before. That makes everything harder to understand. After Diane died, the house became unbearably quiet. Silence has weight. No one tells you that. The refrigerator hum sounds louder. Floorboards creak differently. You find yourself speaking aloud just to hear another voice. Emily started calling every Sunday evening. Without fail. 6 o'clock. 45 minutes on average. Sometimes longer. Daniel usually joined during the last 10 minutes. Need anything, Harold? No. You sure? I'm sure. You don't have to do everything yourself anymore. I smiled whenever he said that. I thought he was being considerate. Maybe he believed he was. People can sincerely believe they're helping while slowly convincing themselves that someone else's independence has become an inconvenience. Around my 70th birthday, little conversations began changing. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like temperature shifts you barely notice until winter arrives. Dad, have you thought about simplifying your finances? You've got accounts all over the place. Managing property gets harder as people get older. Paperwork must be exhausting. None of those statements were false. That was what made them effective. Because every one of them contained enough truth to make the conclusion feel reasonable. I did have multiple accounts. Checking, savings, investment accounts, rental income, property taxes, insurance renewals. Nothing extraordinary. Just the accumulated paperwork of a life lived carefully. I handled everything myself. Always had. Still balanced every statement with a calculator. Still kept handwritten records. Still knew exactly where every dollar went. Daniel admired that. At least that's what he said. You've done an incredible job. That sentence usually came before another one. But, there's almost always a but. I just don't want you carrying unnecessary stress. Stress. Interesting word. Because nobody had actually asked whether I felt stressed. They assumed. Or perhaps they hoped I would eventually assume it too. The funny thing is, I wasn't slowing down nearly as much as everyone seemed eager to believe. Every Tuesday morning I volunteered at the community workshop, repairing donated furniture. Every Thursday I met 3 retired co-workers for breakfast. I still mowed my own lawn. Still climbed ladders. Still changed furnace filters. Still drove myself everywhere. Yes, my knees complained. My back reminded me about old injuries. But I wasn't incapable. I was simply older. Those aren't the same thing. One afternoon Daniel watched me replacing the kitchen faucet. "You know," he said casually, "most people your age would just hire somebody." I tightened the last fitting. It took me 30 minutes. He laughed. "Exactly. What does that mean?" "It means your time's worth more than 30 minutes under a sink." At the time, it sounded thoughtful. Months later I realized something. Every conversation slowly moved toward the same destination. Not what I could still do. What I eventually wouldn't be able to do. There is an important difference. One respects reality. The other quietly writes your future before you've arrived there. I didn't notice the pattern. Not yet. Because when someone earns your trust over years instead of days, you stop examining individual conversations. You simply accept them as love. Love has a peculiar way of disguising repetition. If someone you barely knew suggested that you were becoming forgetful, you would probably correct them immediately. If a stranger hinted that you might eventually struggle with paperwork, you would smile politely and move on. But when those same observations come from the people you've spent years believing have your best interests at heart, they settle somewhere deeper. Not because they're necessarily true, but because you assume they're being offered with care instead of intention. That was the season of my life I had entered without realizing it. Every few weeks, another small suggestion appeared. "Dad, maybe let us keep copies of your insurance policies. You've got so many passwords, we should probably have a backup list. What happens if you're traveling and someone needs access to your accounts?" Always practical. Always reasonable. Never urgent. Daniel was especially good at presenting ideas, as though he'd only just thought of them. He'd lean back in his chair, glance toward the ceiling for a second, then say, "You know what just occurred to me?" As if the thought had floated into the room by accident. Emily approached things differently. She worried. At least she appeared to. "Dad, I just don't want anything to happen where we're scrambling." She'd reach across the table and squeeze my hand. I've seen families go through terrible situations because nobody planned ahead. Planning, preparation, organization. Those words became the background music of every visit. None of them sounded threatening. Why would they? I'd spent my own career preaching preparation. Measure twice. Cut once. Keep records. Think ahead. If someone had asked whether I believed in planning for the future, I would have answered yes without hesitation. I just hadn't considered that planning can sometimes become another word for control. The first time I noticed something unusual happened on a Saturday afternoon in late September. Emily and Daniel had invited me over for lunch. Nothing special. Homemade soup. Fresh bread. A football game playing quietly in the background. Their son, Caleb, who had just turned 12, spent most of the afternoon trying to convince me to play a new board game with him. I lost twice. He celebrated both victories as though he'd won a championship. Watching him laugh reminded me of Emily at the same age. That same unstoppable excitement. The same inability to hide happiness. Children don't perform joy. Adults often do. While Caleb was upstairs getting another game, Daniel walked into the dining room carrying a folder. Blue. Neatly organized. Tabs sticking out from the side. "I've been meaning to ask you about something." I looked up from my coffee. "Sure." He placed the folder on the table, but didn't open it immediately. "You remember Mike? Your coworker?" "No, the guy from church. The one whose father had the stroke." I nodded. "I remember." Daniel sighed. "It was awful." "What happened?" "No one knew where anything was." He shook his head slowly. Accounts, insurance, medical paperwork, property taxes. He paused. The family spent almost 8 months sorting everything out. Emily walked in carrying dessert plates. She picked up the conversation naturally. It made me think about us. I smiled. I'm healthier than Mike's father. You are. But none of us gets to schedule emergencies. Again. Technically true. Daniel finally opened the folder. These aren't complicated. What are they? Mostly authorization forms. For what? So if you're ever in the hospital or traveling or unable to deal with paperwork, someone can help. I flipped through the first few pages. Dense text. Legal language. Several signature lines. I frowned. I should probably read these. Daniel laughed lightly. Of course. Then he added something almost invisible. They're standard documents. Standard. Such a comforting word. Emily sat beside me. We're not asking you to give anything away. I know. We just want things to be easier if something unexpected happens. I closed the folder. I'd rather take these home. For just a moment. Something changed. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Daniel smiled. Emily nodded. But both reactions arrived a fraction too late. As though disappointment had appeared first. And been covered afterward. Absolutely, Daniel said. No rush. He handed me the folder. Take all the time you need. Looking back now, I think they expected me to sign everything that afternoon. Instead, I carried the papers home. Not because I suspected anything. Simply because I'd always read documents before signing them. It was one of the habits my father drilled into me. He used to say, the fastest way to lose something important is to sign something you don't understand. He had grown up during the Depression. Nothing escaped his attention. Every receipt stayed filed. Every agreement got reviewed. When I was 16, I became impatient while he was reading a warranty for a lawn mower. Dad, nobody reads those. Without looking up, he answered, the people who wrote it certainly did. At the time, I rolled my eyes. Decades later, I heard his voice every time I signed anything. That evening, I made dinner, washed the dishes, settled into my recliner and opened the blue folder. The first document looked exactly as Daniel described. A medical authorization. Reasonable. The second allowed access to certain financial records under specific circumstances. Again, understandable. Then I reached the fourth document. Its title caught my attention immediately. Durable financial power of attorney. I adjusted my reading glasses. Started over. Read every line. Then I read it again. The language wasn't outrageous. It didn't say Daniel or Emily automatically owned anything. It stated that an appointed individual could act broadly on my behalf regarding financial matters. Real estate. Banking. Investments. Contracts. Tax filings. Property transactions. A surprisingly wide range of authority. I sat there for almost 40 minutes making notes in the margins. One sentence especially bothered me. Not because it was illegal. Because it was broad. Extremely broad. I highlighted it. Then continued reading. Near the back of the folder, another document discussed property management authority. Then another regarding beneficiary coordination. Each one made sense independently. Together, they created a picture much larger than the casual explanation I'd been given over lunch. By 11 that night, I wasn't frightened. I was confused. Why hadn't Daniel simply said these were power of attorney documents? Why call them mostly authorization forms? Maybe he assumed the legal terminology would overwhelm me. Maybe he was trying to simplify the explanation. Both possibilities existed. I refused to jump to conclusions. The next morning I called Emily. I've been reading the paperwork. Okay. I have a few questions. There was a brief silence. Like what? This financial power of attorney. Though, it's standard. I know that's what Daniel said. It is. I'd still like someone independent to explain it. Another pause. Longer this time. You don't trust us. There it was. Not anger. Not accusation. Disappointment. Or at least the appearance of disappointment. I answered carefully. I trust you enough to ask questions. You could ask us. I am. We already explained. I'd still like legal advice. Her voice softened. I guess that makes me a little sad. Why? Because it feels like you think we'd trick you. The conversation ended politely. But something lingered after we hung up. Not guilt. Not suspicion. Pressure. Very gentle pressure. The kind that's difficult to point at because each individual sentence sounds perfectly harmless. 2 days later Daniel called. I heard you had questions. I do. No problem. He sounded cheerful. I'll explain anything. I appreciate that. What worries you? The scope. It only matters if something happens. I know. You can revoke it anytime. I understand. So what's the issue? I looked at the highlighted sentence again. I'd still prefer my attorney reviews it. Daniel laughed. Not mockingly. Almost sympathetically. Harold. Yes. And you'll spend $600 for someone to tell you exactly what I already told you. Maybe. Maybe not. But his answer bothered me more than the document itself. Because instead of saying, that's a good idea, he tried convincing me not to. Why? That question stayed with me for the rest of the week. Not because I believed there was a conspiracy. Because I couldn't think of any reason an honest person would object to independent advice. The following Thursday, I drove to breakfast with my old co-workers. There were only 4 of us left who still met regularly. Frank, Eddie, Leon, and me. We'd spent decades solving manufacturing problems together. Old habits never disappear. Eventually, every conversation became another problem to analyze. After breakfast, Frank noticed the folder sitting on the passenger seat when I offered him a ride home. Buying a business. He joked. No, I laughed. Just paperwork. What kind? My daughter wants me to sign some planning documents. He nodded. Estate stuff. Something like that. You have a lawyer. I do. Then let him earn his fee. Simple. Matter of fact. No emotion attached. Just common sense. As Frank got out of the truck, he leaned back in through the window. My brother signed everything his son put in front of him. What happened? Frank shrugged. Nothing criminal. But he spent 3 years asking permission to do things with money he'd earned over 40 years. He closed the door gently. Never sign because somebody makes you feel guilty for reading. Those words stayed with me all afternoon. Not because they confirmed my fears. Because they reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. Trust doesn't eliminate the need for understanding. Real trust welcomes understanding. It doesn't rush past it. The following Monday, I called my attorney's office. I had worked with the same small firm for almost 20 years. Not because I needed constant legal advice, but because I believed in continuity. The Laurie. The following week, Rebecca called. I've finished the draft. That was quick. You were already organized. I laughed. My accountant used to call me obsessive. I prefer thorough. She invited me to stop by Friday afternoon. This time the folder she handed me was grey instead of blue. Thinner too. There are fewer documents. There are. She pointed to the first page. This is a limited financial power of attorney. Limited. It only becomes effective if specific conditions are met. Meaning, if you're declared unable to manage your affairs by the standards we've outlined. I nodded. And even then, the authority is limited to the areas you've specifically approved. She turned another page. This document requires written reporting for major financial decisions. Reporting to whom? You selected your accountant and your financial advisor as independent recipients. I smiled. So nobody operates in the dark. Exactly. She looked at me carefully. I don't draft documents assuming people will behave badly. You don't. No, I draft them assuming people are human. That sentence impressed me. Because it didn't accuse anyone. It simply acknowledged reality. Good people can make poor decisions. Loving families can still disagree about money. Trust is valuable. Verification is wisdom. They'll probably ask why it's different, I said. They might. What should I tell them? Rebecca shrugged gently. The truth. Which is, you wanted documents that reflected your wishes. Simple. Nothing dramatic. Nothing confrontational. Just accurate. Before I left, she asked one final question. Harold. Yes. Has anyone besides your daughter and son-in-law seen the original paperwork? I don't think so. If they continue encouraging you to sign those specific documents, let me know. You think I should be worried? I think you should pay attention. That wasn't the same thing. And somehow it felt even more important. 2 Sundays later, Emily invited me to dinner again. Roast chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. The same meal Diane used to make on birthdays. Emily had learned the recipe years earlier. For a while it almost felt like old times. Caleb talked non-stop about a science competition. He'd built a bridge from balsa wood that supported almost 40 pounds before collapsing. Daniel teased him. You inherited your grandfather's stubbornness. Caleb grinned. I hope so. So do I answered. That earned me a smile from both of them. For an hour nothing felt strained. Then Caleb excused himself to finish homework upstairs. The moment his footsteps disappeared, Daniel stood. I almost forgot. He walked into the office and returned carrying the familiar blue folder. He placed it on the dining table. I figured we'd finish this tonight. I looked at it without touching it. I already told you. I know. But we made a few sticky notes where signatures go. Emily added quietly, it'll only take 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That was the first time either of them had mentioned time. As though the length of the signing mattered more than the significance of the documents. I've already had an attorney prepare different paperwork. Daniel blinked. Different? Yes. What was wrong with these? I've decided they don't reflect what I want. His expression remained pleasant. But only just. They're standard documents. I've heard that several times. They are. I don't doubt it. Then why replace them? I folded my hands on the table. Because I prefer documents that activate only if I'm actually unable to manage my affairs. Emily frowned. That complicates everything. For whom? She hesitated. For everyone. Not for me. Daniel leaned back. It creates delays. It creates safeguards. They're unnecessary. According to whom? Silence. Not hostile. Just uncomfortable. Finally Emily spoke. Dad. What? You make it sound like we'd misuse anything. I haven't said that. But that's what this feels like. I chose my next words very carefully. It feels to me like you're more disappointed about losing authority than relieved I'm protecting myself. Neither of them answered immediately. The room became remarkably still. The refrigerator hummed softly from the kitchen. A clock ticked above the doorway. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. Daniel finally spoke. "That's unfair." "It might be. I've done nothing but help you." "That's true. I've driven you to appointments." "Yes. I've fixed things around your house." "Yes. I've never asked you for money." "I know. So why are we having this conversation?" Because that was exactly the question I'd been asking myself. Not why I was refusing. Why they kept insisting. Most people once told someone preferred different legal documents would simply say, "That makes sense." Instead, we were still discussing it. "I appreciate everything you've done," I said quietly. "I always will. But appreciation doesn't require me to sign documents I don't fully agree with." Daniel looked at the blue folder. Then closed it. "I think you're making this into something it isn't." "I hope I am." That answer seemed to surprise him. "You hope you are." "Of course. I'd much rather discover I've misunderstood than discover I ignored something important." Emily looked down at her plate. She didn't touch the rest of her dinner. Neither did I. When I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake one simple observation. Neither of them had asked to read the revised documents. If their concern had truly been planning for emergencies, wouldn't they have wanted to know how the new plan worked? Instead, all of the discussion had focused on why I wasn't signing the original papers. That distinction stayed with me long after I turned off the lights and went to bed. Sometimes the questions people don't ask tell you as much as the ones they do. And for the first time, I began wondering whether this story was about paperwork at all, or whether the paperwork was simply the first visible piece of something much larger. Sleep came slowly that night. Not because I was afraid. Because my mind kept returning to the same uncomfortable question. When does concern become influence? There isn't a precise moment. No alarm sounds. No line appears on the floor. It happens gradually. A suggestion becomes a recommendation. A recommendation becomes an expectation. Eventually, the expectation feels so normal that questioning it seems unreasonable. That realization bothered me more than the documents themselves. The paperwork could be rewritten. Relationships were harder. I didn't want to become one of those older parents who assumed every disagreement hid selfish motives. I'd met enough people like that over the years. Some had driven away perfectly loving families because they mistook independence for disrespect. I refused to become cynical. But refusing cynicism didn't mean refusing reality. Those are different choices. The next Tuesday, I met my financial advisor, Richard, for our quarterly review. Richard and I had worked together for almost 15 years. He was 64 now, meticulous with numbers and surprisingly blunt for someone whose profession depended on diplomacy. We reviewed the usual reports. Investment performance, rental income, property maintenance costs, projected taxes. Nothing unexpected. Toward the end of the meeting, I mentioned the documents. Not dramatically. Just as another item requiring attention. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands. "Have you signed anything?" "No." "Good. You think they're dangerous." "I think they're powerful." "That's different." "It is." He leaned back. "I've seen powers of attorney used exactly as intended. And they've saved families enormous stress. I've also seen them abused." He paused. "Not always maliciously." "What do you mean?" "Sometimes an adult child becomes so convinced they're making better financial decisions that they stop asking permission." He looked directly at me. "They don't think they're stealing." They think they're improving. That sentence landed harder than I expected. Because it fit Daniel almost perfectly. Daniel believed in efficiency, optimization, removing obstacles. If he genuinely thought my cautious approach slowed everything down, would he convince himself that taking control was simply practical? Richard continued. The biggest warning sign isn't the document. What is? Someone discouraging independent advice. Rebecca had said nearly the same thing. Different professions. Same conclusion. Coincidence was becoming harder to argue. Before I left, Richard surprised me. If you're comfortable, I'd like copies of whatever you eventually sign. Why? So if someone ever instructs me to move money under power of attorney, I know exactly what authority exists. I smiled. Another safeguard. Exactly. People often assume safeguards exist because we distrust everyone. I've come to believe the opposite. Safeguards exist because trust deserves protection. Without them, even good intentions can drift. Over the next month, life settled into what appeared to be normal again. Emily still called most Sundays. Daniel still texted occasionally. Caleb still invited me to baseball games. The conversations about paperwork stopped. At least on the surface. But small things began catching my attention. One afternoon Emily asked, "Have you ever thought about selling the lake cabin?" No, you hardly use it. I spend 2 weeks there every autumn. That's not much. It doesn't have to be. She nodded. I just wondered. Another day Daniel mentioned that one of my duplexes had increased dramatically in value. You could cash out now. I don't need to. But the market's strong. I know. Just something to think about. Again, nothing inappropriate. Nothing aggressive. Yet almost every discussion involving my finances ended with a suggestion that something should change. Rarely did anyone ask why I'd arranged things the way I had. Assumptions are quiet things. They don't announce themselves. They simply replace curiosity. One Saturday morning, Caleb came over by himself. Emily had a work event. Daniel was showing a property to clients. So Caleb spent the afternoon helping me replace the boards on the back deck. He'd grown nearly 6 inches over the past year. Still awkward with a hammer. Still determined. After we finished, we sat on the porch drinking lemonade. He looked out across the yard. Mom says you should move closer to us. Does she? She worries. I know. He kicked lightly at one of the porch posts. Dad says houses are wasted on old people. I turned toward him. What did he say? Caleb frowned. I don't know. He said something like. The boy searched for the words. That people your age don't need that much space because it's inefficient. Children rarely quote adults perfectly. But they often capture the meaning. I smiled gently. What do you think? He shrugged. I think this is where Grandma lived. It is. And where Mom grew up. Yes. So it doesn't seem wasted. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then Caleb asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Grandpa. Yes. If somebody owns something, why do other people keep talking about what they should do with it? I laughed softly. I've been asking myself something similar. He nodded as though that made perfect sense. At 12 years old, he still approached ownership as something uncomplicated. Adults rarely do. That evening, after Caleb went home, I found myself walking slowly through every room of the house. The dining room table Diane had insisted on buying even though we couldn't really afford it at the time. The hallway where Emily had measured her height every birthday. The garage shelf Daniel had reinforced years earlier. Memories don't increase a property's market value. But they certainly increase its value. There is a difference. And not everyone measures worth the same way. About 3 weeks later, something happened that shifted my thinking completely. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No discovery. Just a phone call. The receptionist at my bank knew me well enough to recognize my voice. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." "Morning, Lisa. I actually meant to call you." "You did?" "Yes. There was an inquiry regarding your accounts yesterday." I frowned. "What kind of inquiry?" "Nothing confidential was released." My stomach tightened slightly. But someone asked about the process for acting under a financial power of attorney. I felt very still. "Who?" "I'm sorry. I can't identify the person." "Privacy policy." "I understand. But since no documents were on file, we declined to discuss your accounts." "I appreciate that." She hesitated. "I just thought you'd want to know someone had asked general procedural questions." "Thank you." After we hung up, I remained seated at the kitchen table for a long time. Maybe it had nothing to do with me. Maybe someone had asked on behalf of another relative. Maybe. There were many innocent explanations. But the timing unsettled me. Instead of calling Emily immediately, I called Rebecca. She listened carefully. Then asked one question. "Did the bank volunteer this information?" "Yes." "Interesting." "Why?" "Because they obviously considered the inquiry unusual enough to mention." "What should I do?" Nothing. Not yet." She paused. "But start keeping notes." "Notes? Dates? Conversations? Requests? Anything related to financial authority?" "You think this matters?" "I think documentation is never a mistake." After hanging up, I bought a simple black notebook from the pharmacy. Nothing fancy. College ruled. 100 pages. That evening I wrote my first entry. The date. The bank call. Exactly what had been said. No opinions. No accusations. Just fact. I had no idea then how valuable that little notebook would eventually become. Not because it proved anyone guilty. Because memory changes. Written records don't. And without realizing it, I had just begun quietly gathering the evidence that would one day change everything. The notebook became part of my evening routine. Not because something happened every day. Most days nothing happened at all. I'd have breakfast, read the newspaper, volunteer at the furniture workshop, call an old friend, water the tomatoes behind the garage, live the quiet life I'd spent decades earning. Then, before bed, I'd open the notebook. If nothing relevant had happened, I'd simply write. No financial discussions today. That was all. At first it felt unnecessary. Almost excessive. But after 3 weeks, a pattern began appearing that I never would have noticed from memory alone. Nearly every interaction eventually drifted toward the same subjects. The house, the duplexes, the investment accounts, estate planning. Not every conversation, but enough that the repetition became impossible to ignore. What surprised me most wasn't how often the topics came up. It was who introduced them. Almost never me. One Thursday afternoon, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. She carried 2 grocery bags. I was already at the store. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She unpacked fresh fruit, soup, bread, and coffee. Little things she knew I liked. When she finished, she looked around the kitchen. "You've kept everything exactly the same." I smiled. "I like it." She ran her fingers across the countertop. "This place feels smaller than I remember." "I think you've just gotten used to larger houses." She laughed. "Maybe." For several minutes we talked about Caleb's school. Her job. The neighbors. Then she looked toward the dining room. Dad, yes. Can I ask something? Of course. Promise you won't take it personally. Those words rarely introduce comfortable conversations. I'll try. She folded her hands around her coffee mug. I worry that you're stuck. Stuck? In the past. I looked around the kitchen. The cabinets Diane and I had painted together. The clock we'd received as an anniversary gift. The curtains Emily herself had helped choose 20 years earlier. What makes you say that? You don't change anything. I replace things when they wear out. I don't mean repairs. What do you mean? She searched for the right words. I don't know. It feels like you're preserving everything. I considered that. Maybe I am. Why? Because not everything old needs replacing. She smiled sadly. I guess that's where we are different. Maybe. She stared into her coffee. I don't really understand wanting things to stay the same. There are worse qualities. I know. She looked back at me. But life keeps moving. Yes. It doesn't wait. I know. She hesitated. And sometimes holding on too tightly keeps us from making good decisions. There it was again. Not directly about money. But somehow. Always adjacent to it. I decided to ask something I'd been wondering for weeks. Emily. What? When did you start worrying so much about my finances? She looked surprised. I've always cared. I know. But when did you start thinking I couldn't manage them? I don't think that. You've suggested simplifying. Planning. Consolidating. Selling. Signing documents. I spoke calmly. No accusation. Just observation. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. I don't know. Maybe after Mom died. Why then? Because. She stopped. Then started again. You seemed lonely. I was. And I guess. She sighed. I started seeing you as older. That answer felt painfully honest. Not cruel. Honest. Grief had changed how she saw me. Not only emotionally. Practically. She no longer saw the father who solved problems. She saw someone who might eventually become one. Those aren't the same person. But the transition between them is rarely discussed. The notebook grew thicker. October 3rd. Daniel mentioned downsizing. October 8th. Emily asked whether I still needed 2 checking accounts. October 15th. Conversation about hiring a property manager. October 21st. Question about where I kept original deeds. None of these entries proved anything. Individually, they were harmless. Together, they told a story. A story of increasing interest in areas of my life that had never previously attracted much attention. Rebecca reviewed several of the entries during one of our meetings. She nodded thoughtfully. You've done exactly what I hoped. I haven't done much. You've separated facts from feelings. She tapped the notebook. That matters. I still don't know whether I'm imagining this. You may be. And I may not. Exactly. She smiled. The purpose of documentation isn't to confirm suspicions. It's to prevent imagination from replacing evidence. Another sentence worth remembering. In early November, something happened that neither Rebecca nor I expected. My accountant Martin called. His voice sounded puzzled. Harold, everything all right? I received an interesting email. What kind? Someone requesting copies of your depreciation schedules. I frowned. Who? It was signed by Daniel. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. What exactly did he ask for? Martin opened the email while we spoke. He wrote that he was helping organize your financial hour.